I'm Spencer Mazyck, and joining me now is lawyer turned grocer Danielle Vogel. She is the founder of Glens Garden Market, Washington, D.C.'s first all-local grocery store. Welcome, Danielle. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Spencer.
So you come from a long line of grocers. In fact, you're the fourth generation. So first, let's talk just a little bit about your father. What grocery store chain did he create?
My father created the Food Emporium chain, which is primarily based in New York City, although it has a few outposts in the suburbs. He had about 100 stores by the end of his run with Food Emporium.
Yeah, and I would say that Food Emporium is still very popular here in New York City. So based on your family history, Danielle, it seems as though you were destined to open a food market. So can you tell us, why did you go to law school?
My mother had a mantra growing up. We had a saying in the household. It was, girls, you can be whatever you want after your federal clerkships. So going to law school was somewhat prerequisite to being a member of my family.
Well, and also you spent some time working for your hometown congressman before law school. Did that influence your decision at all in any way?
It did. I mean, in the same way that ending up as a grocer was predestined, I think going to law school was equally likely. However, out of college, I spent a few years on Capitol Hill working for Chris Shays, who represented the town that I grew up in, Greenwich, Connecticut. And I learned along the way that he sought out and preferred the counsel of lawyers. And so I sort of felt to some extent that no matter how well prepared I was to give him advice, if a lawyer crossed his path on his way to the vote, their advice would prevail. And so I ended up going to law school in an expedited format. So I finished in 2.5 years so that I could get back to the Hill more quickly and give him advice that he was more likely to take.
After graduating from American law, you actually went directly to the Department of Justice. So what role did you take there?
I did. I was accepted into the Attorney General Honors Program, where I was an environmental litigator. And I was working in a group that was called the Power Plants Litigation Group, and we were suing power companies for violations of the Clean Air Act under the new source review provision of that law.
So Danielle, had you always been interested in environmental law, or was that something that actually developed while you were in law school?
It developed a little bit prior to law school, actually. My original interest was in issues related to democracy, so campaign finance reform and issues of the like. And then right out of school, I went to work for an organization called the Public Interest Research Group, and I was basically writing their propaganda. And they are heavily focused on the environment. And I found that with regard to the environment, the more you know, the more outraged you become. And so as I continued my environmental education by working at PIRG, the Public Interest Research Group, I really became sort of emboldened to pursue a career in environmental advocacy.
What are some of the issues in environmental advocacy that's important to you?
The number one issue I think that's facing our globe as we move forward is energy consumption. Which is, everything from the fuel that we burn to the way that we burn it, to the way that we capture emissions, to the way that we sort of exist in a very environmentally inefficient culture. And so that's everything from the enforcement of the Clean Air Act to the reformation of national energy policy to living a more energy conscious lifestyle on a daily basis, which is sort of how I ended up opening a grocery store,
and
ironically enough.
I want to get to the grocery store in just a second, but after the Department of Justice, you actually went on to work for Joe Lieberman, Senator Joe Lieberman. Can you tell us what was your position with him?
I was his environmental counsel, and at the time, I actually transitioned back there right after the '08 cycle. So the president had just been elected, and if you recall, Senator Lieberman actually endorsed John McCain at the Republican National Convention.
Yes, I remember that.
Which created a few vacancies on his staff. And he had always been a leader in the climate change arena, and he was gearing up actually with Senator McCain at the time to introduce the next round of climate change legislation. And I joined his staff in time to be the one that got to help him with that. So we spent 2.5 years together drafting the last major Senate climate change bill, which was called the American Power Act.
And so when did you begin thinking about opening up your own locally grown food store? Was that while you were working for the senator or at some point after that?
It was at the end of while I was working for the senator. Going into the food industry is something that's always sort of nagged at my genetic legacy. But I only ever cared about politics. That was all I ever wanted to do. And I found myself in a political scenario during that time in the Senate where the prognosis for political progress became dire. The majority had changed in the House. It had become somewhat clear that the president was less committed to environmental progress than I had thought he was. My boss, Senator Lieberman, was retiring. And there didn't seem to be a great venue for at least climate change legislative progress for the indefinite political future. And so as that effort was beginning to wind down, I started to think about how I could sort of re-engage and reinvigorate my efforts in a way that could continue to make change even in the absence of the possibility of legislative progress. And that's how I came up with the idea of Glens Garden Market. And the notion there is, regardless of your climate politics, every time you walk through the door and you eat something that was grown locally and raised in a sustainable fashion, you're making progress one bite at a time.
Well, let's talk about this grown locally. Where exactly do you source the foods from the store, which I should mention is actually named after your father, Glen?
It is, indeed. It's actually named after both my father and my great-great-grandfather, who was the first in his family in the food industry. And my maiden name is Rosengarten. So their first foray into grocery was called the Garden Market, which was a reference to our last name. But in my case, it's sort of a double entendre because it's such a garden fresh market concept. So it's my dad and reaching even further back into the history.
Wow, there's a lot of meaning there in that name.
Indeed.
So where do you source your foods from?
So we source from the states of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So that reaches from New York at the southern end, or I'm sorry, from Virginia at the southern end up to New York. And we capture Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, DC, of course, and New York, which is wonderfully bountiful. Sadly, we do not capture New Jersey. It skirts just to the side of the watershed. I would love to have captured that produce, but we narrowly miss it.
Yeah, I bet you there's a lot of good stuff there in New Jersey that you guys unfortunately can't have. Then, is there any
Garden State after all?
Is there? Yeah, exactly. Is there any particular reason why though you chose those specific states?
I thought that it would have been fairly arbitrary to put my finger on a map and draw a circle around it. But just logically thinking about the way food sheds work, it seemed like drawing the lines around our watershed made a whole lot of sense. Because as humans, we derive our vitality from water. And the same is certainly true for our agricultural systems.
Well, and is everything in the store locally produced with very little exceptions?
Yes. So we have, there are a couple very small sections of the store that we refer to as the forbidden fruit of the non-indigenous tree.
Wow.
AKA the forbidden zone. It's very me. But the idea there is there are things that I thought folks would probably need in order to better enjoy the things that we sell them that are grown locally. Those things include salt, spices generally, sugar, a couple of various sort of prepared foods and gluten-free foods that folks have increasingly sort of required of their grocers. Soy milk falls in that category, though eventually we'd like to start making our own in the store. But it's really a very small smattering of regional or non-regional necessities.
And when you came to the decision to actually open up Glens Garden, did your family, were they ecstatic about the idea of you carrying on the family tradition?
No.
No?
Not even a little ecstatic. They were not supportive would be a nice way to put it. Having 40 years of experience in the field, I think they knew exactly what I was getting myself into. And they were, to say trepidatious doesn't really do justice. My mother was downright furious.
Wait, what? You had already had your federal clerkship or the equivalent of, so why was she concerned?
I couldn't agree more. That's a psychology I don't think we have time to get into.
But so I guess then the question is, did you have also the financial support that you needed in opening up Glens Garden?
I did. It's actually almost completely privately financed.
Which is, I asked the question because a lot of times whenever people think about taking these risks like this, opening a business, it is really a financial risk for them, but you're saying that that wasn't your situation, not really the case for you.
It wasn't. I had the luxury of not having to go to the banks for a lion's share of the money. To be completely honest, my father passed away 10 years ago, and he left some life insurance money to my sisters and I, and that was the seed money that I used to start the business in his honor.
Well, and can you tell us just one more time, though, what do you hope to accomplish with Glens Garden Market? What's the goal? What's the purpose, Danielle?
The goal is to elevate artisanally produced craft food in our region. There is a lot of fantastic food coming out in very small batches, and oftentimes the only place to get it is at the farmer's market from the person that made it. And I'm in the business of making that wonderful food available more broadly all the time, so that if you don't have time to get up, or if you don't have the desire to get up early on a Sunday morning and go to the DuPont Circle Farmers Market, you can swing by Glens at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday and get the same spectacular stuff. So it's good for the local economy, it's great for the environment, and it's really nice to know where your food comes from. It just happens to make it taste a little bit better.
I couldn't agree more with you on that front. And have you used your legal background and training in opening and managing a grocery store?
I have. I mean, I'm negotiating contracts all day long, whether it be with vendors or the landlord or employees or, potential new business partners. And whether or not that requires the full scope of my legal education, it certainly imbues those negotiations with a level of confidence that I know I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone to law school.
And finally, you mentioned your father's passing just a little while ago, but was it his dream to open an environmentally friendly, locally grown food store right before he passed away?
The environment wasn't necessarily his driving force, but it was a lifelong goal of his to open up the space underneath. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the space underneath the 59th Street Bridge, which is actually now a food emporium, was the very first Manhattan farmers market at the turn of the century. And that was the place where farmers would come in from the suburbs, before they were sort of known as the suburbs, and peddle their wares to the residents of New York City. And he wanted to restore that space to its original splendor and bring a farmers market atmosphere into sort of a grocery store format. And that's exactly what I've done.
Yeah, and so despite what some of your other family members might think, I'm sure that your father is looking down on you right now. He's very proud of what you've accomplished. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about it.
Thank you, Spencer. Have a great day.
You too. For more information on this or other topics, subscribe to BloombergLaw.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody.